Why is every single influencer starting a podcast? I'm not even talking just YouTubers, I'm talking about TikTok creators as well. Especially since the pandemic, it seems like every single week there's a new influencer who's dropping a podcast. Let's get into why podcasts are becoming the new hot platform every single influencer is getting on. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Janice and I make videos all around internet culture and creative living. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely stick around and hit subscribe if you enjoyed this video. It's currently fall, so I have some fall background playing on my TV right here. Before we get started, grab your favorite fall beverage or a little snack, sit back and let's get to the bottom of this. In 2021, Spotify acquired Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy podcast for over $60 million. In 2020, during the heart of the pandemic, Spotify paid Joe Rogan almost $100 million to acquire his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. Also in 2020, Bill Simmons, the founder of the Ringer Network, which produces a bunch of TV, film, and sports podcasts, sold his company to Spotify for over $200 million. Earlier this year, Amazon acquired Exactly Right Media's podcasts, which include the famous My Favorite Murder podcast, along with a bunch of their other true crime podcasts, for a whopping $100 million deal. To better understand why these big companies are spending so much money on podcasts, I think it might be helpful to go back to the very beginning and talk about the history of podcasts. The very first podcast program/platform was created by two guys, Adam Curry and Dave Weiner. Adam used to work for MTV as a DJ.
Hi, Adam Curry back with you on MTV. Well, here's the story. They've been called rowdy, raunchy, gut-level rockers.
And Dave was a programmer. Together, they teamed up to create a program called iPodder, which enabled people to download audio blogs and listen to them on their iPods. As more and more people started streaming and listening to audio shows on iPodder, this journalist called Ben Hammersley published an article talking about the rise of online radio. And in this article, he actually coined the term we now use every single day called podcasting, which is actually a combination of the words iPod and broadcast.
Wow. So, as you just heard, my name's Ben Hammersley. I once invented the word podcast. I'm sorry, I apologize. Blah, blah, blah. So I work as a futurist.
In 2005, podcasting actually became the word of the year, according to the New Oxford American Dictionary. In 2006, Steve Jobs does a keynote where he shows people how to record podcasts on their computers using GarageBand. Do you guys remember GarageBand?
A lot of people enjoying iPods and all sorts of on-the-go activities. In automobiles in this country, 40% of all autos sold this year are offering iPod connectivity as an option.
In 2007, English comedian Ricky Gervais sets the world record for the most podcast downloads. He was getting over 250,000 downloads per episode. Fast forward to 2013, Apple announces that it has 1 billion podcast subscribers. Then in 2019, Spotify goes through with one of its first podcast deals, purchasing Gimlet Media, which is a very big true crime podcast company, for a whopping $200 million. The Gimlet Media and Spotify deal helps bring Spotify to the forefront of the podcast arena and really helps make them a top competitor in the space just behind Apple. So this definitely helped bring more awareness to the public that Spotify was in the podcast space to stay. From 2016 to 2019, there were only a handful of influencers who actually had active podcasts. The only influencers I can think of that I was listening to at that time were Shane Dawson and maybe Pretty Basic, which is Remy Cruz and Alicia Marie's podcasts. But other than that, I can't really think of anyone else who was making podcasts on the weekly basis. It also didn't help that in 2020, we had a worldwide pandemic that paused every single thing in the world. And during this time, because it was so popular for people to listen to podcasts in their car, on their commute to work and back home, people thought podcasts were going to die out. But surprisingly, podcasting actually became way more popular during the pandemic. I think this is in part because most influencers during the pandemic didn't have the luxury of going out there and making content in the world every single day as they were used to. So they had to kind of improvise and make content that was more conducive to the stay-at-home orders that we had. So because they couldn't really go out to parties or travel, they had to find a way to make interesting content from home. And on the flip side, because their audiences were also working from home at the time and not really commuting, they were listening to these podcasts while multitasking through tasks like working from home and just doing chores around the home. In trying to answer this question the best way I could, I thought it would be interesting to go back and try to find out why the very first influencer podcasters even got into podcasting in the first place. The first reason I found was that these influencers started realizing that their audiences were also growing with them, and so their high school audiences were now getting to college and getting real jobs, and so they had to commute to work. They had limited amounts of time to actually sit down and watch their YouTube videos and their other content. So these influencers creating audio type content for them to stream on their way to work or on their way to school was actually very smart. The second and third reason are actually kind of related in the sense that these influencers seemed to have tried really hard to transition from digital media to traditional media. This transition, which usually comes around a time when influencers feel like they've reached their peak, is very difficult to navigate. A lot of influencers have struggled really hard to make that transition. For instance, there are so many influencers who tried really hard to get into acting.
What's your name, funny guy?
I'm Zane.
You're Zane. You're out.
Come on, I'm Zane.
Get the fuck off my beach.
But Hollywood at the time wasn't really interested in hiring YouTubers or Instagram models to come and like be in their TV shows or movies. So these influencers had to kind of like make stuff happen for them. So that's why Logan Paul literally had an entire movie that he co-wrote, I'm pretty sure, and like produced with his friends and like had all his influencer friends in it. And also Shane Dawson had his own movie. I think he had like multiple movies where he like wrote and like starred in them and produced them and directed them, because Hollywood was just very anti-influencers and honestly still is a little bit. And as a result, because podcasting became increasingly more popular in the mainstream, these influencers saw that as kind of like a nice middle ground between digital and traditional, because with podcasting they can actually show their real personalities. They can really connect with their audience in a more authentic and not very edited or unfiltered way. They could also really market themselves as entertainers and show that they can handle doing long form content. Podcasting helped these influencers market themselves as hosts, which is a traditional thing. Think of like a Ryan Seacrest, a Tyra Banks. These hosts are big stars in the traditional space, and they've also been able to use their network and their experience in that hosting space to create shows around their names. Tyra Banks created America's Next Top Model.
You want to be on top?
And has since gone on to host a bunch of other shows, including America's Got Talent and currently Dancing with the Stars. So getting into podcasts was a way for these influencers to kind of like bridge that gap between them and Hollywood, which is so freaking sad. Influencers are very talented, even though their skill set might be a tad bit different from Hollywood's. I think Hollywood, since the rise of TikTok, has been better about like embracing influencers more.
Social media sensations, the D'Amelio family. Welcome to season 2.
I really think Hollywood has seen that in order for them to survive, they need to tap into the digital space and work with digital creators, which is a beautiful thing, and I wish they had recognized that way sooner, because they could have really nurtured a bunch of like incredible talent from like the YouTube or Vine days and turned them into something much more bigger. Like look at Quinta Brunson, she came from the YouTube space, and look at Lil Dicky, who now has a show called Dave on Hulu, and also Lily Singh, who literally had a talk show. I really think Hollywood needs to invest more in digital talent and see them as equals. Now let's talk about the present and why every single influencer you're following or subscribed to has a podcast. According to Variety magazine, marketing research publications IAB and PwC both predicted that in 2022, ad revenue from podcasting was going to surpass $2 billion. Another research study showed that 45% of podcast listeners have a household income that is more than $250,000. Both of these statistics show that a lot of people who listen to podcasts have a lot of spending power, and that means brands and advertisers are looking to promote their products and services to that audience. So what the hell does that mean for influencers? This means if they get into the podcast space, there's way more opportunities for them to work with brands to make more money. Compared to brand deals that most influencers do on YouTube, TikTok, or IG, in podcasting, they can promote more than one brand within an episode. I listened to a bunch of podcasts in preparation for this video, and I saw that the number of average ads within each episode was about 3 to 6 ads. At the very beginning of the episode, there will be an ad playing, and then like 15 minutes in, there's another ad. There's just like way more opportunities for these influencers to work with brands and make way more money than they would on like a YouTube video where they can only have one brand sponsor the video. Compared to producing a YouTube video, podcasts are a little bit easier to produce because they take less time to actually edit. And once you get your podcast equipment, there's honestly no cost added to run a successful podcast. Another big appeal about podcasts that I've already mentioned in this video, which I'm still going to mention again because it's huge, podcasts allow influencers to show up authentically to their audience in a way that isn't filtered and also not that edited. This really helps their audience see the influencer as like a regular person who's just like them, and also kind of understand who they are and what they value. Podcast listening can be a very intimate experience as well. So if your audience is listening to you while, say, like doing the dishes or driving to work, it can feel like you're that comforting friend or like sister or brother that they don't really have. And them blocking out the world to listen to that influencer's voice and thoughts and opinions about something can bring both of them together in a really meaningful way. Because the number of men and the number of women that listen to podcasts are almost equal, even though men listen to podcasts way more than women, this is a great opportunity for creators because they get to kind of have like an even audience, which is very desirable to some brands because they can better market their products to that audience. Like I mentioned earlier, I listened to a lot of influencer podcasts in preparation for this video, and I want to share a couple of the things that I learned and also share some tips for anyone out there who might be an influencer or might not really be an influencer who's thinking of starting a podcast. Because of all the benefits I've listed so far, I think it's very smart for any influencer, no matter your size, even if you're not an influencer, I think there's a huge opportunity in the podcast space right now for you to get in, find a niche, and create a meaningful audience. The podcast space is very lucrative, and if you're someone who really enjoys talking and sharing your ideas and thoughts on a certain topic, this could be a very cool space for you to get into. If you're just starting out, I would highly discourage you from doing a solo podcast. When I say solo podcast, what I mean is something like the Emma Chamberlain podcast. Unless you're Emma Chamberlain or someone who is at her level, I highly discourage this because a lot of people listen to podcasts because people like listening to other people talk. There's kind of a voyeuristic element to it. If I went into the world and I was just eavesdropping on two strangers talking, I'd probably be scorned at. But the podcast space has kind of like normalized that, and a lot of people really enjoy like being the fly on the wall while listening to two people share their thoughts and ideologies on certain topics. So when it's just you, that back and forth is kind of lost, and it might not really set you up for success long term. The exception, of course, is if you're actually going to be having guests on your podcast. So if you're the only host and you actually plan on having guests come on the podcast every episode, then that's way more accessible, because once you have guests on your podcast, there's a chance that those guests are going to bring their audiences to listen to that podcast as well. The most successful podcasts I found were those that actually had co-hosts on the show for every single episode. Sometimes they'll have guests that come on the show, but really it's all about the hosts. I also found that the podcasts that began with a captivating clip really helped like draw me into the podcast. So if you're making yours, make sure that you're starting off the podcast with something exciting that is gonna like tease what's coming later on in the episode. When you're starting out, don't really try to put in that many ads in your podcast, because to me that just feels like a turn off. So if the first thing I'm listening to is an ad, there's a chance that I'm just like, oh my god, I don't want to listen to this. I would say like have maybe 1 or 2 ads, maybe one like after the first 5 minutes and then another one like right before the episode ends, because ads can be a turnoff no matter who you are. Before we wrap up, I want to add that there's a huge space for influencers who are in the mid-level or like very big to start their own like influencer podcast networks. What that basically means is they can have their friends create podcasts under their network and then like one day sell that to like a big publication, or even just keep growing it and like have it become like a huge thing where they can actually use that long term as a calling card to, you know, get an actual show. Right now in Hollywood, everyone is looking for IP, which means they want to invest in content that is already existing. And if influencers started out making these podcasts, there's a chance that these podcasts could be turned into an unscripted or a scripted show in the future. A prime example of this is Inanna Sarkis, who actually started her career on Vine. She recently wrote, directed, and produced a scripted podcast called Zaya. I think this is very brilliant for her to do this because, first of all, it's way cheaper than actually shooting an entire pilot, which is gonna cost millions. And second of all, I would not be surprised if she's only doing this because she wants to use this to hopefully sell that show as an actual TV show later on. I really hope this video gets you to think about podcasts in a more serious way. And also let me know in the comments below what your favorite influencer podcast is. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. I create videos every single week around influencer culture and creative living. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.